Has the DEA given up on the war on marijuana? It wasn't very long ago that if you were growing copious amounts of marijuana outside of some town somewhere and everybody in town knew about it, odds were pretty good that at some point or another the DEA would drop by. They would want to interview your staff, and probably right after they put everybody in handcuffs. We just don't see any stories today about these big marijuana busts, and at one time they were very common. Well, the federal law really hasn't changed. What happened? Hey folks, my name's Chris, and for the past 16 years I've been a marijuana attorney. I've been a lobbyist and an activist. I've been working mostly on medical marijuana laws and legalization at both the state and federal levels. And I thought I would dedicate this channel to all the complicated but absolutely fascinating issues that swirl around in the marijuana movement. And most importantly, why are things the way they are today when we're talking about marijuana? Whatever happened to the DEA, and what does it mean today as we see a whole new breed of products emerge? These are hemp-derived intoxicants. I'm talking about Delta 8, D9, HHC, and all the others. Where's the DEA? Well, let's take a look. All right, well, let's get the basics. So in 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act. That's the framework that we have for all drugs in the United States, both illicit and licit. And it's still the law we have. And it was in that act that Congress granted authority to the Drug Enforcement Administration to enforce all the things that they created in that framework. So DEA enforces all the drug laws, and marijuana squarely in that list of controlled substances. It's at the top of the list in Schedule 1. So DEA has been in charge of law enforcement around marijuana really since then. And they were super aggressive about enforcement throughout that time. You could get in massive amounts of trouble with the DEA growing marijuana and distributing it and all the rest. So there was a huge amount of work that went into these grows being all clandestine. But of course that changed when states started adopting medical marijuana laws. So beginning in 96 and really at a pretty rapid clip. After that, you'd see states adding on these kinds of laws. And then those operators couldn't really be under the radar. You're sort of out in the open, you're paying taxes and all the rest. So problem is the DEA wasn't really changing its attitude. It was still being super aggressive. And so it was arresting a lot of people during that time. Obama administration era was pretty bad for people who were trying to operate in these programs as they were getting launched. Well, eventually things did calm down, and that happened in the 2010s. So the first thing was in 2013, and that was where the Department of Justice, which is where the DEA actually is part of the Department of Justice. So the Department of Justice came out with this memo that they basically were sending out to all their prosecuting attorneys out in the states, and it was basically just saying, okay, well, we've got these licensed systems at the state level. What are our actual priorities? If you're picking and choosing where to put your resources, where do these licensees kind of fit on the list? And so it was really that kind of advice. And, it was the first time that they really started to spell out things like, yeah, there are going to be businesses and they need to be careful. And more to the point, what it did is it just sort of said, here's what we care about as the federal government. And so it sort of gave the industry and states something like the rules of the road. So as long as they weren't encouraging interstate trafficking or, allowing, guns to be around or distribution to minors and, things that would sort of obviously not be a part of a regulatory system. So that was good news. And so it was kind of the first time it seemed like there was a sort of way to be okay with the federal government. And the next thing that happened was actually where Congress created an amendment that changed the way the budget worked. And so Congress has what's called the power over the purse. They basically are the ones that write the checks on behalf of the government. So it's this huge power, really. And what they did is they went to the Department of Justice and they said, okay, we're going to essentially remove your funding if you guys go after any of the businesses that are operating in medical marijuana states and if they're compliant with state law, you can't go after them. They're basically, no funding for that. So that was tested. The Department of Justice there was a case where it sort of got tested a little bit, but the court was pretty clear that, Congress can do that, and no, you can't go after those businesses. And so between that, which by the way, that was called the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment, but that's kind of become now the way that the budget works. So between the two, it really cooled down the DEA. Now I will say this, that amendment only covered medical marijuana. It actually didn't cover any of the sort of adult use 21 and over legalization stuff. And there's a huge amount of that. But you don't really ever see the DEA getting involved in any of that. So it's kind of gotten quiet since then. Now, I don't think we really know why the DEA isn't going after the adult use market, the licensees that are sort of out in the public, but not covered by the amendment I mentioned. And I don't know if they've kind of backed off the illicit market as well. It's kind of hard to say, but I definitely don't see the kind of press coverage that there used to be. Now, there is still law enforcement activity that happens on federal lands, but you just don't see these big press moments anymore where they're just busting people with marijuana. I don't know why, but my gut is the DEA just feels like the politics probably isn't on their side right now. They have bigger fish to fry, and why bother? Well, then we have this whole new discussion around hemp-derived intoxicants. And of course, what I mean is Delta 8 and Delta 10 and all this whole new bunch of intoxicants that get converted from CBD that comes from hemp. And so there is this loophole that was created through the Farm Bill. I've got videos on how all this stuff happened, but here's the bottom line. Apparently, these drugs, while they have been out since about 2019, the DEA has known about them, and it's come to the conclusion that they're just completely, totally illegal. I know there's a lot of folks who will make the case that they're sort of not controlled substances, but I can tell you that the law enforcement folks, they definitely think that they're controlled substances. They treat anything that's been converted from CBD into some form of THC. They're treating that like an analog drug. And there's a whole law called the Analog Drug Act. And so they're basically just saying, yeah, that's what these are. But they're still not doing any enforcement. So where are you, DEA? I mean, it's not like this stuff's been going on in secret. It's now a multi-billion-dollar industry every year, and it's growing basically by the day. And so it's kind of weird that we don't see the DEA doing anything other than these sort of one-off letters that go to different state regulators when they ask really specific questions. We just don't see, the guns and badges that we used to see back in the 80s and the 90s and the first part of the century. So anyway, it's just really weird. I have no real idea why we would see them holding back because, You don't have like the Cole memo that I referred to earlier. You don't have Congress coming in and sort of defunding some aspect of their work. They call it part of the Analog Act. Go for it, but they're just not. And the only explanation that I have for that is that maybe they just aren't really sure if they're right. And so they don't want to stick their neck out and go have somebody cut it off in a courtroom. So that's a little brutal, but I think that might be part of it. But anyway, so here's the DEA after all these years. They're not really doing a whole lot of enforcement that we see anyway when it comes to marijuana. And they're not really doing any enforcement at all when it comes to hemp-derived intoxicants. So that's my video. I do these kind of videos because I think it's really useful just to have straight up explanations for what are often really complicated, thorny little problems that create even worse policy when we get to marijuana. If you want other people to see a video like this, the best way to do it is just hit like and subscribe. I'm not looking for donations or anything like that, but I would appreciate it if you could help get this around. All right, folks, that's it for this week. See you next time.